So welcome everyone and to the IISE transaction webinar series. And my name is Yuding. I'm the editor-in-chief of IISE transaction on faculty of Texas A&M University. IISE transaction webinar series and features 7 talks based on the article to be published as a January 2023 special issue of the journal. And I just want to remind everyone here, the articles in our special issue will be free access for 12 months, starting December 1st this year. And today is our number 6 webinar, and we are excited to have Dr. Wally Hopp with us. I don't really think Dr. Hopp needs introduction. You know, people here probably all know him pretty well. Nevertheless, let me give it a try. So Dr. Hopp is best known for his research in supply chain management. I got to know of Dr. Hopp and because of his celebrated textbook, Factory Physics, and which won the IISE Book of the Year Award in 1998. He went on to win the IISE Technical Innovation Award in 2005, SME Education Award 2006, was elected fellows of many professional societies, including IISE Informs, and also elected member of National Academy of Engineering in 2014. I didn't really meet Dr. Hopp in person until 2019. So luckily that was before pandemic. Otherwise, I probably could have missed the opportunity until this very day. At that time, I was part of an effort to petition Informs to start a new journal, Informs Journal on Data Science. And by the way, that journal got started 2 years ago. Dr. Hopp agreed to serve on the advisory committee for that effort and did give me many valuable advices. Through that experience, I find Dr. Hopp is not only a great scholar, but also a great colleague who is so much willing to lend his helping hand whenever needed for promoting the interests of our professional community. And today, Dr. Hopp is going to talk to us about a very timely topic, supply chain resilience, which becomes everyday dinner table conversation topic, not because of we have resilient supply chain, because of the lack thereof. So Wally, you know, we are so delighted to have you here today, and the platform is yours whenever you are ready.
Okay, well, thank you for that kind introduction, Yu. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation to write the paper for the special issue and also to give this talk. Let me see if I can share my screen with you all here. Okay, can you all see that? All right. Okay, well, so as you said, I'm going to talk in this presentation about enhancing supply chain resilience, and this is a paper that Özlem Pinar and I wrote for the special issue, and which came out of exactly the circumstances that you described. That is that supply chain has gone from being sort of an academic research topic and a specialty for, you know, procurement officers to dinner table conversation. For the past 10 years, we've seen shortages of drugs of all types due to basic process failures like quality control. In 2017, we had the hurricane year from hell that disrupted various kinds of supply chains. For instance, saline bag production in Puerto Rico by Hurricane Maria. And of course, the mother of all supply chain disruptions has been the pandemic for the past couple of years, which seems to have disrupted everything. So supply chain has been on our in our papers and on our tips of our tongues as we've talked. And this has spurred a great deal of research by individual scholars and also government studies. And so Özlem Pinar and I were part of 3 National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine studies, the first of which analyzed post-hurricane supply chain resilience and was published in 2020. The second addressed resilience in medical product supply chains and came out in 2022. And the third dealt with resiliency of supply chains for influenza vaccines and also came out this year. Now, these reports are practice-oriented reports, right? They weren't original research where we created new models or collected new data, but rather synthesized the literature on supply chain resilience and applied it to guide practitioners in creating more effective and reliable supply chains. And from these reports, we addressed various congressional committees. We held workshops with government officials and put together teaching materials for emergency responders, and have tried hard to build our base for promoting more resilient supply chains across the spectrum of industries. Anyway, when you asked me to write a paper for this special issue, I thought, this is an opportunity for us to take a look at these syntheses of our knowledge of supply chains and assess where we may have opportunities for further research to address things that we don't know so well. So the paper and this talk follow the outline I have up here. The first issue is basically setting the stage by describing the mechanics of supply chains and how they fail. And for this audience, you all are very knowledgeable about supply chains. I'll go very quickly here, but for some of the practitioners, the emergency responders, government officials, politicians, and so forth, the mechanics of supply chain are kind of mysterious, and so it's useful to start there. Then I'll go to a second question, which is how much resilience we need. And this is the issue of trade-offs, right? More resilience of one supply chain may mean less of another because resources are finite. And so ultimately we will strike trade-offs, and we'd like to do it better than just by screaming at each other like we tend to do, like, for instance, in the pandemic when we had lockdown versus, education trade-offs. Those were hard trade-offs to make, and we didn't do them terribly well. And we're still just yelling at each other instead of really trying to figure out better ways to do it. The third issue is really the core of this talk, which is how to build supply chain resilience. And I'll present a framework that ran through those three studies and which helps us enumerate our options and think about, how do you put together an integrated strategy for building supply chain resilience. And then I'll finish up with the results of a literature survey we did that looked at what has been studied and what hasn't, and identify some gaps. But I won't wait to identify research opportunities till the end. Instead, I'll go along in each section. I'll pause and say, here are the insights we can draw from this perspective, and then what are gaps that present research opportunities. So hopefully by the time we get to the end, we'll have laid out a lot of things that are potential paths forward that folks like all of you could help us address. Okay, so here we go. Question number one, how do supply chains fail? Well, we know that supply chains are multi-layered, multi-tiered networks that can span many organizations, many continents, many different kinds of industries, perhaps. They have inventory at various levels, and they can fail in a host of ways, right? So a disruption of a piece of the supply chain, maybe way up in a high tier of the supply chain, can ripple through and cause a shortage to customers, but it does so with a time lag because of those inventories that get eaten up. And then again, restoring the supply chain can also take time as inventory works its way through the supply chain. In addition to production nodes, we have transportation nodes, which are also vulnerable to disruption. And we have information flows, right? The things that go backward in the supply chain and guide the production and distribution decisions that can also be disrupted. So these are complicated networks that can be fragile. Now, the ways that they can fail, there are lots and lots of triggers, right? We can have war in Ukraine, we can have a worldwide pandemic, we can have an earthquake. All of those those trigger events can lead to supply chain disruptions, but the disruptions themselves basically take three modes: a demand surge, where demand outstrips capacity; a capacity reduction, where capacity falls behind demand; or a coordination failure where we have enough aggregate supply to meet aggregate demand, but because of allocation problems, we still experience shortages. Hoarding is an example of this. We got enough out there, but it all gets eaten up and winds up in people's cupboards or something, okay? The virtue of making this distinction of the three failure modes is that there are some protective mechanisms that can address the very high level modes of failure. Inventory, for instance. We don't really care whether the shortage was because of a hurricane or a quality problem. An inventory is going to provide protection either way. There are other types of mechanisms, as we'll get to later, that you have to have more detailed information about the trigger events down, in this hierarchy. Okay, so let's pause just a little bit. Even at this rudimentary level of just mechanical modeling of the supply chain, we can draw a few insights. The first one is the one I just mentioned, which is there are three modes of failure. Another is that capacity and inventory are complementary buffers. That is, capacity has a lead time to become available and can produce indefinitely, but inventory is available immediately and runs out. So the two of them kind of provide complements to each other. Also, if you start looking at risks, independence and flexibility in the capacity can make them more resistant to failure and therefore more resilient. So we have some insights already, but we also have some gaps. For instance, vulnerabilities in interconnected supply chains. We've seen some very odd behaviors during these emergency events where a disruption in a supply chain in one area can ripple through to another because they're connected by shared capacity for integrated circuit production, shared capacity for containers, shared capacity for labor. And that those disruptions have rocked supply chains across industries. And we haven't really modeled them that way. We have tended to look at supply chains by individual products or maybe closely related products and haven't addressed this interconnected issue. Hoarding behavior has proven to be quite substantial in terms of the way it exacerbates shortages and is not yet really part of our thinking about risk assessments. The role of capacity flexibility. Let me give you a personal example on that one. I owned a bakery through most of the pandemic. Don't ask me why. I owned a bakery. And what we had in the early days of the pandemic were severe shortages at the retail level for baking supplies, flour, yeast, and a glut of availability on the commercial side. I could buy 60-pound bags of flour and 16-pound boxes of yeast, no problem. But you couldn't find that stuff anywhere in the store. So we spent a bunch of time repackaging that stuff and selling it to customers who wanted to bake at home while they were in lockdowns. And the craziness was that the producers of those baking supplies were very inflexible with respect to the packaging sizes. And so they had plenty of supply, but it took a long time to shift the supply from the large commercial packages to the small retail packaging. So flexibility is a lever, and we have rigidities in our supply chains that have been recently exposed and maybe warrant some deeper study. Reverse flows and reusable inventory. I mentioned containers. Those are what we consider reusable inventory that is essential to transportation. And we found situations where they're on the wrong side of the ocean, and lots of delays were exacerbated by those. And finally, restoring normal supply chains. Our models tend to focus on supply chain behavior in terms of how it fails and how we can shore them up. But in hurricanes and other natural disasters, the process of getting supply chains back to normal can be painful and slow. For instance, when we were studying Puerto Rico for the hurricane study, we heard stories of the retail supply chains being delayed in terms of getting back to normal because FEMA had offered higher wages to the truck drivers to, distribute emergency supplies. And so the drivers weren't available to the normal supply chain. So they kind of lengthened the disruptions that would have occurred otherwise. And so restoring supply chains is an important issue and one that we haven't really studied much yet. Okay, on to question number 2. How much supply resilience do we need? And I raise this because resources are limited. And so anything that we spend on making supply chains for one product more reliable ultimately may mean less resources to make another supply chain more reliable. And so therefore, we're going to strike a balance. How do we think about that sensibly? Well, to do that, we first have to define what we mean by supply chain resilience, right? We can't just wave our hands. So a working definition is something like supply chain resilience is the ability of a supply chain to deliver a sufficient volume and quality of product during normal and emergency times. So therefore, it's basically resistant to disruption from normal variation or some shocks from emergencies. We could formalize that by basically stating that as a probability. Say the probability a supply chain will meet demand during a specified time interval, such as a year. If we go with that, then it sounds like service in an inventory model. So we could use inventory modeling, like our good old friend, the news vendor model, to give us a sort of starting point for thinking about this question of how much resilience is enough. So to do that, what we would say is, all right, let's define supply chain resilience as the probability of preventing a customer shortage. And let's define our demand distribution as the distribution of the shortfall. That is, let's think to begin with as stockpiling as our only lever for building resilience. We'll relax that later. But for now, let's suppose we're just going to put inventory into the strategic national stockpile, for instance. Then the demand on that stockpile is the shortage in the marketplace. So that's what F is. And then to use a news vendor calculation to decide what the stock level, the stockpile supply, I've written it here, we would then have the cost of an underage, that is, what is the cost of a shortage and what is the cost of an overage, basically the carrying cost. And that underage cost is really kind of the thing that's going to drive this calculation, because that underage cost depends on what perspective you're using, right? If you're the producer, then you're going to look at that as a business continuity thing and look at lost sales and so forth for having an underage. Whereas if you're a public government official, you're going to look at that and say, well, that's harm to people. If that's a drug and we're depriving people, then there's going to be health consequences, maybe even mortality. And so there'd be a much bigger cost associated with a shortage. But anyway, if we took a perspective, say a social perspective, and we could estimate these costs, then we would see that we would have different target levels for the resilience in different products. Now, of course, this is only a very rudimentary first step, because inventory is not the only way that we can build resilience, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And so if we did this calculation, we would have to then sort of adjust the model to be able to account for other things, such as bringing on new capacity or other things. But secondly, we would have to address that question of public versus private. So with this, we can make a couple of insights. One is, it's pretty clear if you're using a critical ratio like the news vendor model gives us, that we're not going to aim for 100% resilience. There's no such thing as just it's resilient, it's not resilient. It's not a binary. It's really a continuum. And on that continuum, we're going to clearly get different attractive targets for different products. So for instance, something that has a very high cost of a shortage should have a higher resilience target. So for instance, critical drugs that are life and death kind of products are clearly more important than, say, frivolous consumer goods, pet rocks or something, right? And finally, there are going to be places where this cost of an underage here is very different from the private perspective than it is from the public perspective. Generic drugs, for instance. A generic drug may have a very low cost of a shortage from the perspective of the producer, but a very high shortage from the cost of social welfare, perspective of social welfare, and therefore indicate a gap between what the market's likely to provide and what society needs, and hence suggests that maybe public intervention makes sense. Okay, so those are some insights. What are research opportunities? Well, lots. This is an area that we just haven't really gone down much. I mean, if you look at the government studies, ours mentions it, but almost nobody else does. And if you look at the research, almost nobody tries to do this. But there are forecasting challenges. How do you forecast what the risks of a shortage are? The social cost estimates, how do you do this? Quality adjusted life years, how do you do this in some kind of consistent way? Dynamic modeling, right? If I'm using inventory, I can use a static news vendor because inventory is immediately available. And all I care about is the cumulative shortage. It doesn't matter whether it is a spike followed by a drop off or a steady, moderate shortage. But if I'm providing something like inventory, then the dynamic nature of the shortage and the remedy matter. Allocation of limited resources, that cost of what the shortage produces, that is how much it impacts people, depends on how you allocate it. If you do a good job of, say, distributing a drug that's in shortage to people who need it most, the cost will be low. Whereas if you do a bad job of that, the cost may be high. And so you can't really leave out allocation when you're trying to decide how much resilience you need. When you start thinking about inventory can be spatially distributed. And then there's a trade-off between pooling efficiencies and speed of distribution. And so there's more complexity than just a simple news vendor. And finally, these coordination failures like hoarding that I mentioned, if you're going to have those, does that influence your decision about how much or how little resilience you should be aiming for? So lots of opportunities to take that basic news vendor and move toward something that's more realistic. Okay, well, suppose we have a target or targets for various products. Now we raise the question of how should we go about building supply chain resilience? And in the 3 NASEM studies, we did that in all 3 of those studies, but we focused on different specific instances. But in all of them, we basically had this time-phased model in mind. So on the left side of this framework, we have these triggers. So triggers are events that happen, like a fire breaks out in a production plant for some input in some supply chain. The first layer along the time frame of protection is mitigation. So that fire is broken out. If you have a sprinkler system that puts out the fire, that's a mitigation measure, and it prevents the potential event from even turning into a disruptive event, right? We never actually get a production shortfall because we put the fire out before it disrupted anything. But suppose mitigation doesn't work and we do disrupt production. The plant burned down and it's offline, and now we have ourselves a production shortfall. Then we hit the layer of preparedness, right? Preparedness are actions that prevent the disruption from turning into a shortage. So inventory is an example of a preparedness strategy. And so we might never see a shortage to the marketplace if we had enough inventory in the supply chain, in the strategic national stockpile, wherever, to head it off. But if that preparedness layer doesn't prevent the shortage from occurring, now we have one final layer, which is response. And response is basically the shortage has now appeared, and we take measures that prevent or mitigate harm to the end users. All 3 of these layers, an example, for instance, just to give you one, is we had a very severe shortfall of PPE in the early days of the pandemic. So one of the response measures we used was N95 mask reuse, right? So people use their masks not one time, but maybe all week long, and that allowed us to have better protection of healthcare workers, even though there was a big shortage of masks. All three of these layers are founded on awareness, which provides the information to assess risks and evaluate interventions. So let me walk through each of these quickly. Actually, let me show that in the medical product supply chain study, we made these shields and made it look a lot more heroic and dynamic so that it would catch people's attention, but same basic framework. Awareness. So awareness is about collecting, processing, and sharing information. So we've divided it up into transparency, make data available, like putting sourcing data on drug labels, analytics, processing that data into information, for instance, creating risk ratings for suppliers that buyers could use in making decisions about purchasing, and communication, sharing information with the relevant stakeholders. So that's like a public database in the medical study. We called for a public database that would share the raw data as well as the summary statistics that people created so that we could foster better discussions about supply chain reliability and risks. So mitigation has two pieces, hardening and diversification. The sprinkler system example I mentioned earlier is an example of hardening because it makes that specific node less likely to fail. Diversification is basically a form of redundancy, so dual sourcing. So if you have two sources of a component, then if one fails, the other one can keep producing. So you make your total supply less vulnerable to catastrophic failure. This doesn't get much study, to be honest, in our analysis of supply chains, right? We tend to think much more of preparedness because this is where we're talking about the supply chain itself. I should mention that mitigation can address demand surges as well as supply shortages. Like, the sprinkler system basically heads off a supply shortage, but things like the shutdowns, mask mandates, and things were meant to temper the surge in demand for ICU capacity, ventilators, and other medical supplies in short supply. So you can also mitigate a demand surge as well as a supply disruption. Whether you've got a demand surge or a supply disruption or a coordination failure, the preparedness measures are aimed at preventing or reducing these shortages. And I already mentioned inventory. The strategic national stockpile is one, but there are lots and lots of inventories in supply chains. The complement to that is capacity, so surge capacity that can be brought online when we need it, or it's there already, right? In any supply chain, if you go back to my book, Factory Physics, it'll tell you never try to run a supply chain at 100% utilization because you'll get incredibly unresponsive production. And so therefore you should have some buffer capacity in your system already, and supply chains do. And some of that is going to help in the case of a shortage, but you can also have other capacity that's, sort of warm based and could be brought online. Inventory and capacity are are physical buffers. They exist. Contingency planning and readiness are virtual. That is, they turn into capacity and inventory, but it takes some time. So contingency planning is an explicit plan for creating inventory or capacity, while readiness is just a general capability within your institution or organization to do it. So you can kind of think of readiness is your organization's ready to create a plan. A plan is, a way to create capacity, and capacity is a way to create inventory. So just think of this as a big stack of increasingly virtual inventory. You either have it or you're, in some stage of readiness to produce it. And in general, just like in quality control, where, the closer to the customer you are, the more expensive it is. The top level tends to be the most expensive, and the lowest level tends to be the least expensive. And so there's a cost efficiency issue to be addressed, which I'll mention in a little bit here. Last layer is response. And these are things that take place after the shortage is already there. And we'd rather not do this, right? Because I mean, it's going to be better to be ready rather than to have to respond, but you can never be ready for everything. So response is always necessary. And we saw some pretty creative stuff in some of our discussions in these NASEM studies. We heard the medical people refer to this as MacGyvering. You remember that 1980s television show where a guy would take a watch battery and a Bic pen and make a Scud missile out of it? Well, that was kind of what these guys were doing in medicine. So for instance, the first layer here is prophylaxis, which is you've got a shortage and you want to prevent harm to the end users. So we had a very serious shortage of PPE, and the medical people figured out all kinds of makeshift face shields, screens, ventilation systems. We did this in my bakery. We put up plexiglass and so forth. And lots of that went on during the pandemic as a post-shortage response to try to protect people in the face of the scarcities of PPE. They also, the demand reduction example that I mentioned earlier, the N95 mask reuse, that was a demand reduction strategy, which was not planned, right? It was something that came up after the pandemic forced us to think about how to deal with this shortage. But in general, reducing demand through substitution or other measures is a good response measure. And finally, of course, supply increase after the fact. We may not have had any plans, no contingencies, nothing, but there were, General Motors and Ford produced ventilators. There were pop-up N95 mask producers. There was all kinds of this stuff that happened in a sort of an ad hoc way, some of which proved to be kind of inefficient, and in hindsight, even though they were all well-intentioned, we could probably do better. Anyway, all right, well, that's the list. That just gives us an enumerative list of ways that we could make supply chains more robust. But how do you fit them together, right? I mean, you don't just do everything or pick one randomly. There are measures that fit better to certain types of risk. And this diagram, or this figure that I've got up on the screen right now, shows us that if the likelihood of a disruption is high, that is pretty likely to have a shortfall. And think of disruption in terms of the amount. So for instance, suppose we're talking about N95 masks, and say that we have a disruption in the tens of thousands being pretty likely. Then having a stockpile in the tens of thousands, a physical buffer, really makes sense because you can economically justify that. On the other hand, think of disruptions in the millions as being less likely, in which case we might want to have more like the contingency planning, readiness to bring on extra production to meet that because it's less costly and we're less likely to use it. And finally, in the tens or hundreds of millions of shortfall, we might have a very low likelihood of a shortage of that level, in which case we might want to just leave that to our institutional readiness. We know who has to make the decision. We have communication networks for people to talk with each other and get into a war room situation to plan, but we don't want to spend money creating plans or putting inventory for a very, very low probability event. Okay. All right, well, that gives us a general idea, but it's still not very fleshed out. And it doesn't take into account that there are many, many decision makers, stakeholders in these supply chains. So a couple of things about that. One is there are public and private actors, right? Most supply chains are owned and managed by private firms. And so therefore, they're the main managers, but there are government, people involved in setting the rules and inspections and other things. And so there's a balance to be struck between the private and the public sectors. Now, every economist I've ever talked to would argue that decentralized market mechanisms are more efficient than central planning. So for instance, the example of a carbon tax versus technology forcing regulation. If you put a carbon tax, on fossil fuels, then everybody has incentive to buy or produce things that make less use of carbon fuels, and we'll find efficient solutions that will reduce our production of greenhouse gases. On the other hand, if we pick and say we are going to mandate electric cars, we're sort of doing that in a couple of states, then what if that's not the most efficient, right? What if hydrogen cars are better or something like that? So market mechanisms tend to be efficient. On the other hand, we can't count on markets because their incentives are not necessarily aligned with social welfare. And like, for instance, in generic drugs, margins are so very small that producers don't have big incentives to build in lots of supply chain resilience. And therefore, we see lots of drug shortages, even though some of those drugs may be very, very important to public health. So therefore, we have to think about how we resolve these, make use of these market mechanisms, but resolve these misalignments between incentives. All right, well, with all that, we can take a couple of insights. I don't know, this is saying supply chain resilience is complex. Okay, it's got a lot of moving parts, right? There are a lot of things. So there are lots of choices to make. There's lots of optimization to be done. That's kind of obvious. Early intervention is often cheaper than late response. So if you can mitigate rather than do response, or mitigate rather than do preparedness measures, you'll save money. So we need to give some thought to those. Physical and virtual protections need to be coordinated. As I said, if you've got if you can bring on virtual, protections quickly, then you need less physical protection. So you really kind of have to think of them hand in hand. And flexibility is essential to resilience, because flexibility is kind of makes these virtual things more possible than they would be without it. But there are gaps. How do you combine physical and virtual resilience measures? Our models tend not to do that. They tend to focus on one or the other, as opposed to trying to integrate and strike trade-offs and balances between them. Market mechanisms, if I was going to circle one that I think is a gigantic opportunity, it would be market mechanisms for promoting supply chain resilience. What is the carbon tax for incenting supply chain resilience? Right? It's clear that there are some supply chains where the market provides quite high reliability all on its own because of the financial incentives, and others that do not. And I think we know how to spot those, but how do we sort of use a light touch to incent them to provide more resilience? A good open question. Collaboration and coordination, because there are so many actors. A story we heard over and over talking to end users in some of these supply chains, particularly the medical ones, was that people felt, kind of lost. They were not part of the process. And so, coordinating across these complex, multi-institutional networks is a big challenge, and one that probably does warrant more study. All right, last but not least, of the things that we did in the paper was we did a literature review to see what we know, and then sort of laid that on the needs that we saw coming out of this summary framework. And so I won't go over it here because I would bore you to tears, but we organized the literature review into these various areas of the supply chain resilience framework and listed what people are doing. And we found a good cross-section of relevant research in these areas, and we tried to highlight that. But we also found places that were somewhat uncovered. This is the list of things that we took away after going through that exercise, of areas that may be presenting gaps that present research opportunities. One is this analysis of complex network topologies. We tend to model supply chains sort of one at a time, right? I showed a picture earlier in the slides in which I showed, here's a product and here's the supply chain for it. But the reality is that the world is more complex than that. In particular, with respect to capacity, we have overlapping resources that connect up supply chains. And we have lots of people making decisions on the basis of different incentive structures. And the analysis of supply chains that are very complex and interconnected is maybe not best done by a mechanistic analytic model. Maybe we need to do more empirical studies of these topologies. I'm not sure, but we were clearly surprised by, for instance, the fact that 2.5 years into this pandemic, that supply chains are still an absolute mess. They're clearly more complex and fragile than I think most of us thought they were going in, and I think this is part of the reason why. Understanding supply chain stabilization behavior, we've seen this over and over in hurricane, natural disaster situations, that we're not very fast about it, that they're slower to get back online than we thought. And clearly during the pandemic, they've been, painfully slow. Maybe thinking not so much about how supply chains fail, which we have thought lots about, maybe we need to think about how they get repaired more carefully. Enhancing organizational readiness. There have been a few operational scholars, Christoph Locke is one that comes to mind, who've thought about this. He calls them unks, unknown unknowns. How do you prepare? Well, you can't put in safety stock and you can't put in contingency plans because they're by definition unknown. But you can create organizational readiness. Some organizations are better at responding to emergency situations than others, and they have characteristics. And in the organizational behavior area, there are some researchers that study that, but we haven't really leveraged that in our operations modeling and analysis. I think that maybe we could, and it would certainly be fascinating to try. Understanding endogeneity between demand and resource allocation decisions. We can affect demand. So for instance, when you're in vaccines, the study on vaccines, how you distribute short supplies of vaccines affects how the virus spreads and hence affects the demand. And so there is a interconnected decision to be made about how you do allocation and what demand you'll face, and therefore the model becomes different than our typical model of an exogenous demand process, and we're trying to take actions to address it. Interdependencies across supply chain networks and infrastructure. We've seen a lot of supply chains that have relied on common infrastructure, whether be it power, be it transportation resources, be it labor. Labor has been a big one during the pandemic. I don't know that we've studied those so much, and especially in terms of assessing risks, of these major events. Some critical resources can become pinch points in the supply chains. Incorporating stakeholder behavior. There are a lot of different incentives, and they get pretty complicated, and they're not straightforward. I don't know. I mean, we've done plenty of supply chain contract where we assume profit maximizing incentives on the part of private producers, but it's more complex than that, because we clearly see private companies engage in philanthropic activities during natural disasters. We saw, Ford and GM step up and produce ventilators, and people do pitch in from private companies. So the incentive structures are more complex than just maximizing profits. How those affect, what gets done in an emergency when a supply chain is disrupted, I think is still kind of an open question. And finally, optimizing the mix of resiliency strategies. I gave that figure where I basically said, well, for likely things, use physical resources, and for unlikely things, use virtual. But that's like really skimming the surface. If you take that question of what does an optimal mix of resilience look like, and then ask the question, what are the incentives, a question we asked before, that would push us toward that, I think you've got a really rich, avenue of future research ahead, and a really important avenue of research ahead. Okay, well, that's my spiel. I'll conclude by saying that supply chain resilience is clearly one of the grand challenges of our time. It's everywhere now. We all realize how much we depend on supply chains for, life and limb, as well as entertainment and enjoyment. And we're more vulnerable than we really thought we were. These pandemics and other emergencies have spurred public awareness and research funds. So there's an opportunity here to do good things. And I'm hopeful that we'll be smarter in the next big emergency than we were in this one. But to get there, there's a lot to be done by government, private industry, researchers, nonprofits, and so forth. If we're going to produce supply chains that are more resilient and that protect our health, safety, and security in normal times as well as emergency times. But the one big takeaway from this is that operations people are central to addressing those questions. There's no question that the health people and the government officials and the emergency responders cannot do this without us. So for those of you who are already working in this area, thank you. For those of you who are thinking about it, go for it. There's a lot of opportunity. Get some good publications, but also make a difference in the world. So with that, I'll say thank you and invite anybody who might have questions.